Hi everyone. This position comes from a game played today in the Airthings Masters online rapid tournament. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces, Jan Nepomniachtchi has the black, and this is the finals, first game of the first day of the finals. Now the position looks fairly equal, the material is equal, there aren't a lot of pieces left on the board. Probably checkmating your opponent's king is a distant thought. You're not really aiming to do that in the immediate future. However, Jan reminds us to be careful even in a position like this, and he begins to weave a mating net around Magnus's king. He plays the excellent move bishop to c4. So what's the threat here? Well, the bishop and rook are poised to deliver a very typical tactical type of idea here, which is rook to a2 check. If black delivers that check, notice white's king has only one escape square on b4. So these pieces are starting to surround the white king. When you do that, you make quiet moves around your opponent's king. You're not checking him, but you're slowly taking away his escape squares. That's called making or weaving a mating net. And Jan is trying to do that. If he can cover this last remaining escape square, then he would have a checkmate. So, for example, if Magnus ignores this and plays perhaps the natural looking move rook takes g7, then he actually has a losing position. Black has a crushing advantage in this position. And he begins by covering this square right here. How can he do that? There's a few ways you could consider doing that. You could try to move the king forward, like king to b5, and that's a mate in one threat right there. But it turns out not to be the right move because white can quickly destabilize that king, drive it back away from covering b4. Or, for example, king to a5 has the same problem. So the correct move for black here is to play a5. Use the pawn to cover the b4 square. That pawn is more stable. White can't drive away the pawn. So black is threatening a checkmate right here in 1, and there's only one move to stop it. So if this position had occurred, Magnus would have had to play rook to b7 check. It's the only move. You have to check the king so as not to get checkmated yourself. Now the black king here would have two squares to move to. Turns out one of those keeps a winning advantage for black and the other one hands white a draw. Let's look at the wrong move first. The incorrect move is king to a6. That hands white the draw. Let's see why. Here's white's defense. He would play rook to b2 to disrupt that checkmate here on a2. Now black could trade the rooks off, but white would have a good advantage in that endgame a pawn up. So for example, if he plays rook takes b2, king takes b2, maybe the black king comes up, but the white king can move to a3 and stop that a pawn, and white's got a slight advantage. Maybe it's drawn, but black can't win this way. So what would black do after rook to b2? Well, he can try to win with rook to c3 check, driving the white king up to a4, it's the only move, and then dropping back down to c1 with that same sort of checkmate threat. Rook to a1 would be a checkmate in this position. You may wonder, why does he move the rook to c3 first? Why not just drop it down to c1 for this checkmate threat immediately? The problem with that is it gives white time to move his rook out of the way, gaining another escape square here, and so that cancels the checkmate entirely. So that is why rook to c3 check in this position would be the only winning attempt, driving the king up to a4, and then drop the rook back to c1 with a threat of rook to a1 mate. And moving this rook up to b8 doesn't stop that. But unfortunately for black, earlier he chose the wrong square to put his king on because white has this nice check here. Driving the king back, its only move is to a7, and that allows white to pick up the pawn. He's broken out of the mating net. There's no mate anymore. And maybe rook to a1 check is a try here. And after king b4, attacking the black bishop and breaking contact between his rook and his own bishop, black has an unpleasant choice between two endgames. If he takes the bishop, white takes the bishop, and he's going to win this particular two-pawn up rook and pawn endgame. And if instead of taking the bishop, he tries to trade rooks here with rook to a2, perhaps targeting these pawns on the second rank, then white would trade rooks and then enter this winning bishop and pawn endgame. So all of this is possible due to black's incorrect choice of king move in this position. King to a6 doesn't work. Instead, the correct move is king to c5, and this gives black a winning advantage. Let's see why. So he's still threatening this checkmate here. So white has to continue to check the king. He has only one safe check. So he has to play rook to c7 check, or I suppose he could again play rook to b2. But that's not going to work this time. Rook to c3 check, driving the king up to a4 again, and then dropping back down to c1. And now black is threatening this checkmate on a1, and his king is on a better square. Before we saw it on a6, and white had that check. Now it's on c5, and white has no safe checks. So all white can do here is stave off mate with the move rook to b3, intending to interpose the rook on a3 when he gets checked. But then black just picks up the exchange and easily wins this endgame. Okay, so that rook to b2 defense doesn't work in this position after black correctly puts the king on c5 rather than a6. So the only other thing he can try is checking the black king, like rook to c7 check here. But black is soon going to escape the checks. King to d6, only one safe check here. And then king to d7, and white has run out of checks. So there's nothing white can do in the position. He's going to have to give up the exchange here. He's about to get mated on the next move, so he has to take the bishop, give up the exchange. And this is an easily won endgame for black. Okay, maybe not incredibly easy to win, but it's a winning advantage. All right, so going back then, once Jan played bishop to c4, starting to weave this mating net, threatening to push the pawn to a5 to take away the remaining escape square, threatening to mate. What should white do about it? He can't ignore this mating net. So rook takes g7 is the wrong move. Well, it turns out there's only one saving move for white in the position that leads to an equal position, and Magnus found it. It's a rapid game. There's a lot to analyze here, but I think he instinctively knew what to do. The move is bishop to e4. You have to disrupt the mating net immediately before black gets the chance to take away the escape square. You have to attack that rook. You have to break up this formation here. And the computer tells me that's the only move that doesn't lose, and Magnus easily finds it quickly during this rapid game. The game proceeded rook takes f2, and then king b4, getting the king out in the open, off the edge of the board, out of any potential mating nets, and now white is perfectly safe. Black saves his bishop, and then white takes the pawn on g7, and the game eventually petered out to a draw. Okay, so thanks for watching.